everyone. I'm Mark Kabaj. I'm an associate at the Tamarack Institute and president of Here to There Consulting. And joining me today is Michael Quinn Patton, who I'm going to introduce, and then we'll begin a conversation with. Michael's resume is something many of you already know, and probably very few of them on the call don't know, but even if you do know, it's worth going over again, because part of the story of principle-based evaluation is based on Michael's extensive experience on thinking about, learning about, and adapting evaluation ideas and practices, part of his field building work. With more than 45 years of experience as an evaluator, Michael is a generalist who uses all kinds of methods, especially mixed methods, and focuses on adapting the design to the situation, intended users to maximize use, something he framed utilization-focused evaluation in the early 1970s. He's worked with organizations and programs at the international, national, state, and local levels, and quite a bit with philanthropic, not-for-profit, private sector, and government programs. He's also worked across many different cultures and perspectives, and again, as a generalist, worked at a full range of efforts at improving human effectiveness and results. These include things like programs in leadership development, education, human services, the environment, public health, employment, agricultural extension, food systems, human rights, early childhood development, arts, criminal justice, anti-poverty, transportation, diversity, and managing for results in the areas of performance indicators, effective governance, and futuring. This broad base of experience has prompted him to write some books that transcend any one of those areas and include things like utilization-focused evaluation, developmental evaluation, and principles-driven evaluation, which we're going to talk about today, all of which are based even more than most evaluators on systems theory and complexity thinking and systems theory. Michael's also the co-author of a book that had a huge influence in Canada and beyond, Getting to Maybe How the World Has Changed, which he co-wrote with Francis Wesley and Brenda Zimmerman, and includes in there the longest note on developmental evaluation ever conceived, but one that is worthy of the many books that he's written on that topic since. Michael has, as you know, had an enormous influence on the field of social innovation and developmental evaluation in Canada, certainly on the Tamarack Institute and its work on vibrant communities and beyond, and in the work of many of those on the phone. So Michael, that is a long introduction, but it's deserved. Thank you for joining us for what I think is our fourth call together.
Thank you, Mark.
So let's get into this. Michael, I just imagine, someone said, where does Michael live? And I said, if you fly over Minnesota, you're going to see smoke coming in from a house out of sight of St. Paul. And that's Michael working on his next book at a pace that smoke is coming from the typewriter, which I know you don't use. This is this new book you just produced on principle-focused evaluation. It's already, I think it's already out in stores and Amazon. When did it get released, Michael?
November of last year. So it's been out a couple of months.
And I know it's selling well, and we are going to spend the entire call here today talking about it, as well as a series of workshops throughout Canada in March. But today's a real good chance to get a taste of what we're going to explore then. Give us a start here on the essence or the big idea behind principle-focused evaluation.
Well, let me thank you, Mark, for organizing and facilitating this, and thank the Tamarack Institute and the sponsors for the opportunity to talk about it. I think it's helpful to understand the essence of principles-focused evaluation to realize that for 50 years, and that's about how old the profession of evaluation is, we say that evaluation grew up in the projects with a project mentality. The methods, the logic of evaluation is heavily project-based, designing projects, evaluating projects, designing programs, evaluating programs. The methods and approaches of evaluation, the logic models are heavily project-oriented. Projects are mostly closed systems. And so over time, we've gotten very good at doing project evaluation, but as the world has changed, we're being asked to engage in a number of different ways and evaluate in different ways, which includes evaluating strategies, evaluating complex dynamic systems change, design and evaluate systems change interventions, collective impact. And one of the things that I've found cutting across efforts at social innovation and social movements that go beyond projects is they're being guided by principles. And so the essence of principles focused evaluation is that social innovators in particular are guided by principles. They state principles, and so the making principles the focus of evaluation allows us to ask questions about those principles to evaluate their implementation and results. So principles become, in evaluation jargon, the evaluand, the thing evaluated, but that's because they are approached to action, innovation, and programming. They especially work in complex dynamic systems. And I like to say that the essence of principles-focused evaluation is that it flows from the work of principles-driven people who are doing principles-based initiatives. We need to be able to match evaluation to the nature of the work. And so principles-driven people doing principles-based initiatives, principles-focused evaluation is the appropriate match.
And as we were chatting a bit about this, Michael, what struck me about this is evaluators are always trying to get their head around the it being evaluated, and you're making the distinction between sort of a narrow lens on projects and a broader lens on what drives social innovators and all the work they do, or designers. And while this call is about evaluation, this is also very useful work for social innovators and any kind of designer and administrator who also at times struggle to understand the it that drives them and guides their thinking and action.
That's a very important point, and in fact, part of what you'll see, and indeed in the new book, the first half of the new book is actually about what a principle is, how to frame principles in ways that they can be evaluated. One of the things I found in doing the book is that a lot of initiatives and books and articles that have principles in the title don't have any in their content, or that the ways in which people frame principles are sloppy and not really stated in ways that provide much guidance or that can be evaluated. So this is not just about evaluation, it's about how to get clear about what your principles are and how to articulate them in a way that they do provide guidance, and then to evaluate them in a way to see where that guidance takes you.
And so let's play with that a bit then, if we maybe go to the next question, which is, and then we're going to zoom out again, but let's zoom in and get a sense of the kind of questions one explores in a principle-based evaluation. And you've made the point repeatedly when you're dealing with evaluation that there's not necessarily standardized method. It's more of a way of thinking about an intervention and then developing and adapting a methodology that suits the specific context. But sometimes there's general patterns of questions that one would ask. So what kind of questions would you ask if someone said, let's do a principle-focused evaluation?
Well, as you'll see here, I've really identified three overarching questions. When people say they're principles driven and their initiative is principles based, ask, well, how meaningful is that principle to the people to whom it's supposed to be guided? Do they understand it? Do they buy into it? Is it more than just something that came out of a retreat and put on a wall? Is it really providing guidance? And therefore, is it, if it's providing guidance, is it actually adhered to? Are people following the principle? And if they are following it, where does it take you? One of the important things here is to understand that the principles are not just about process. Principles imply something that's going to be different. And so they are results oriented. And so the third question is, where does following a principle take you?
Do you, I know you probably, I know you haven't done research on this, but can you comment or remark on how many groups may struggle to give an answer to question number one? You referred to that practice of going to a retreat and having some principles on a flip chart paper, and that maybe makes it on a mat somewhere, but people don't feel it or haven't internalized that. Can one expect that to be a common occurrence?
It's a great question, and I think it varies a great deal. Part of the challenge is that sometimes these retreats end up with a laundry list of principles, and so this is stated as a question about a particular principle. Is the principle meaningful? But in fact, there's seldom just one principle. There's usually a group of principles. Sometimes they're in a sequence. Sometimes they're interrelated, and sometimes there's an overarching principle. In the United States, we just celebrated Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday at the beginning of last week, and his overarching principle was nonviolence, as was the principle for Gandhi, and everything else flowed from that principle. But more often, there are several principles, and so the meaningfulness question includes how a set of principles interact and whether people remember them, can refer to them, what kind of guidance they actually provide.
Yeah, and I guess even if someone said, no, we're not adhering to that principle, it's not meaningful, that's pretty curious in itself, isn't it? That might reveal something about the organization and or the gap between the kinds of things it finds it's important at a superficial level and the kinds of things it finds important when the heat is on and they're in the pressure cooker of doing their work.
Yeah, a good example of a principle that's widely espoused in government sometimes and in philanthropic foundations and nonprofits is transparency. But transparency is a very tricky principle. And in fact, with levels of approval and what's official and not official and who's in charge and who gets to say something, it turns out that it's not that easy to adhere to the principle of transparency. So evaluating what that means, and getting clear about it. Another common principle, in fact, it's in some ways in my work I found maybe the most widely reported principle is do no harm. Well, it turns out that almost any kind of social change does harm to somebody. You're trying to disrupt systems. Those who have power may lose power. You're trying to redistribute some assets. And so even in medicine, the idea of doing no harm is not terribly meaningful. Usually it's a matter of trade-offs. There are side effects to drugs. You cut off a leg in order to save a life. So it's not a matter of doing no harm. It's a matter of understanding the trade-offs that are involved in any particular action, what the relationship is between those things that redistribute power and resources, and what we do that's harmful in order to achieve a greater good. So asking principles-focused evaluation questions takes us deep into really getting beyond and inside the sort of surface rhetoric of do no harm to how do we actually make decisions? How does a principle like that guide action?
And Michael, like so many of your books, the door of evaluation is really just another door into understanding how humans try and take care of themselves and to make change and deal with paradoxes and ironies and tensions. And so you've got everyone's attention already on the general idea. Let's just maybe take a quick chat about why this book, this topic, and now, and then we'll get into some more examples. But so you have seen so much, you have so many choices about things you can write about, but you chose to write this book now. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I appreciated your introduction, Mark, because you did note in some ways the history of the things that I've been doing. It began with utilization-focused evaluation, which is based upon the principle of focusing on intended use by intended users, and that that principle has guided my 50-year evaluation career. There are other ways of focusing evaluations. There are people who focus evaluations on methodological quality. There are people who focus evaluations on accountability concerns. And people focus on doing evaluations that can be academically published. So there are different ways of engaging in evaluation. And my work has been driven by the principle of utilization-focused evaluation, which got me involved with, as you said, Brenda Zimmerman and Francis Wesley in the McGill-McConnell Leadership Program in Canada, which was focused on social innovation and leadership. And that led Brenda, Francis, and I to study social movements in the book, How the World Has Changed, the one with the yellow cover and the dandelions. And what we found is that social innovators and great social movements like Mothers Against Drunk Driving and Mohammed Yunus's microfinance work were not based upon a project thinking. There was no logic model. There were no SMART goals. They began with a deep conviction that the way things were wrong, that things should not continue the way that they are. And they began to engage those complex systems, not quite certain where they were going to end up. They didn't start out with some clear, specific, and measurable goals. They started out with principles that the way things are not consistent with the principles that we care about. That the principle from Muhammad Yunus was that poor women with no assets should still have some access to capital. The principle of Mothers Against Drunk Driving was that somebody who kills your child should get more than a suspended sentence from when they go to court. That the punishment should fit the crime, and so in following that, that's what at the same time led me to the developmental evaluation work, which is based upon principles of complexity, nonlinearity, and emergence, adaptation. And a part of developmental evaluation was looking at principles of social innovation. And that, as I've worked with that, led to then as the next slide shows, the book on principles-focused evaluation as a major outgrowth of developmental evaluation for social innovation. The work in developmental evaluation really led to highlighting principles-focused evaluation as a particular form of developmental evaluation.
Yep. And maybe we'll just ask the Tamarack folks to move the slide so people can see the title of the book. That this is the book that captures all that, and it's just yet the next iteration of your journey. Michael is a change maker, is an innovator, which in some ways it means it's the next page or chapter in the rest of our journeys as well. If this is,
I should note, Mark, that the cover shows an Inukshuk, which of course is a symbol, these large sculptures in the tundra that First Nations people use to navigate the wilderness in northern parts of Canada. And that particular Inukshuk is a sculpture that I own. It was given to me by the Canadian Evaluation Society when I keynoted there at Banff in something like 1995.
Oh my goodness.
And that provides a nice symbol of something. What a principle does is provide guidance in an uncertain, difficult to manage terrain.
Well, that is actually a beautiful metaphor as a principle providing guidance, and it really raises the question of what a principle is and is not. And maybe we can go to the next slide, and we have a general statement or two here, and then we have a couple slides that make some distinctions between principles of what they are and what they're not. So great metaphor, Michael. Navigating wilderness, some people say whitewater rapids, it provides guidance, but it doesn't tell you precisely what to do.
That's right. That's an important point. So it's not like a recipe that we'll see here in a moment, but if one of the criteria of a principle is that it does provide guidance about how to think or behave towards some desired result. It's based on norms, values, beliefs, experience, and knowledge. But from an evaluation perspective, a principle is a hypothesis until it's evaluated within some context to determine its meaningfulness, its truth for that group of people who are following it, its feasibility and utility for them. And so it's a statement that is behavioral in orientation. It provides guidance about how to behave. And as the next slide shows, then one of the things that's helpful is to distinguish recipes from principles, or in the voluntary sector, nonprofit world, the equivalent of a recipe is a best practice. So recipes and best practices are highly prescriptive. They tell you exactly what to do. A recipe will say add a quarter teaspoon of salt. An adaptive principle, on the other hand, is to season to taste and situation, which means you think about what the dietary restrictions are of people, what kind of ethnic cooking you may be doing, what kind of seasoning may be able to make a food taste particularly good, and what combination of seasonings to use. You may experiment with that and try it out with people. So season to taste and situation provides guidance that tells us, well, what's the situation and who are we cooking for, and what are their constraints, what do they like, and we adapt the seasoning to that. That's an example of a principle. And so on the next slide, shall I continue?
Yep, please continue, and maybe we'll have the next slide forwarded, please.
Yeah. Most folks will be familiar with SMART goals that have been around for a long time and are part of the project mentality. A good goal needs to be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So in the book, much of the book is about explaining and applying what I've called the guide framework. And that means a good principle provides guidance. That guidance is useful. It's inspiring because it's values-based. It's developmental, which means it can be adapted to different situations, and it can be evaluable. And so the guide framework, as the next slide shows, really suggests that the guidance needs to be prescriptive. It needs to give a clear sense of direction. It uses a commanding verb, do this, and it's distinct from an opposite. So when you're articulating a principle, it's clear, for example, that the principle of nonviolence is different than a principle of might makes right. And so knowing what the alternative principles are helps you know that you've got a principle that's actually meaningful. It's useful if it helps you make decisions. It's interpretable, doable, feasible, and actionable. It's inspiring because it's value-based, ethically grounded, meaningful, evokes a sense of purpose, developmental in that it's context sensitive. Best practices and recipes apply anywhere. But principles are highly context sensitive. They have to be interpreted. There's judgment involved. And finally, they can be evaluated on those questions we talked about. Is the principle meaningful? Is it being followed? What results from it? Does it take you where you want to go? So that's the essence of what a principles-focused evaluation deals with, and it begins by specifying what is a high-quality principle, and the guide framework specifies that. And in the workshops we'll be doing together across Canada, the masterclass will go, a lot of what we'll be going into depth in is working with people to articulate good principles that can actually be evaluated and that do meet the guide criteria.
And Michael, this is so helpful, and I know that you always feel a tension between trying to describe a general approach to thing and then offering more tool-like frameworks and processes, and you do it all the time, of course, and that the book is so helpful for doing that. And I wanted to just point out the existence of a tension here for some people in the field, and I've experienced this tension in my own life when one talks about not only evaluating a principle, but being guided by them. And I found in my own life that when I'm unsure of a particular area of work or a practice or an issue, my tolerance levels for principles is quite low. I actually want concrete recipes and practices how to, because I don't feel the issue well, and I don't have the same kind of confidence of just being guided by a general idea. And when and where I'm more comfortable with something, and I have some level of expertise or experience, I not only have a higher tolerance level for principle-based work, but I actually quite demand it, because I often can imagine a particular tool or recipe in a certain circumstances always needing to be adapted and being frustrated by the prescriptive nature of it. So when you wrote this book, can you anticipate people's comfort level with principle-based evaluation varying according to that or some other factor? Their level of comfort with dealing with ambiguity? Yeah.
Well, that's a key part, and it's very much a matter of the distinctions that are in the book, Getting to Maybe: How the World Has Changed, and then developmental evaluation, and continues through principles-focused evaluation in distinguishing simple, complicated, and complex kind of situations. So it's not anti projects and not anti-recipes or best practices, but those only really work in simple space, where you know exactly how. So if you want to replicate a great recipe, then replicate it. That's what you want to do. If there's a known intervention that has been replicated and research based and works in simple space where you know what to do and there's agreement about what to do. So we're trying to eradicate polio in the world. You don't go out and mess with the vaccination dosage. It's known, and we know that it works, and so you get a campaign that gets it administered. But when we're dealing in complex dynamic situations, rapid change, emergence, nonlinearity, best practices don't work. Closed system projects don't work very well. And so this is, your point's really important. Principles-focused evaluation and principles themselves provide guidance in situations of complexity, where situations of complicatedness, where things are complicated, where there are a number of different players and actors, the challenge there is getting people to agree on a set of principles. And in complexity, where you're dealing with lots of turbulence and uncertainty and unpredictability, principles are virtually the only thing that you have to anchor you and to navigate complexity.
Yeah, it's excellent. In fact, we're going to touch on that in one of our follow-up questions, but thank you for that, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who experiences that kind of tension. Michael, why don't we now chat a little bit, because you said a very nice foundation for this. Let's maybe touch on one or two examples of principle-focused evaluation and practice, and then we have three relatively quick questions around niches and conditions and when not to use the approach. And then we're going to open it up for questions, and we've already got a couple of real nice questions in the sidebar here. Let's look at some case studies. So maybe we'll go to the next slide here. Some examples. Oh, maybe we should touch on this before we move on, Michael. This is an important point. What are they not above and beyond recipe? We know they're not recipes, but there's also a couple other things that they're not.
Well, one of the most common questions I get is how principles are different from values, and my framing of that is that values are a statement of belief. So when I say I believe in diversity, that's a belief statement. That doesn't tell me how to behave. And so principles are behavioral. They're values based, but they add a behavioral element to it that tell me what to do. Engage with people around diversity, exercise diversity, not just value diversity. Goals are highly prescriptive. They tell us what we're trying to achieve. And so there's a lot of confusion between goals and principles. And the biggest problem I find is that people treat, as we talked about earlier, principles as window dressing and just rhetoric, rather than actual guidance that both can inform behavior and can be evaluated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So a good example is the next slide that you were very much involved in. As I understand it, in 2002, 15 communities gathered together from across Canada to decide to work together on poverty. And they decided, because of that diversity, very diverse communities facing different kinds of challenges around poverty and having different kinds of interventions in mind, that the coherence across those 15 communities would be based upon a set of principles. And each of these principles that you all developed, part of what I like about the way they're stated is that they state both what will be done, what principle will guide the action, and what will not. So we see the poverty reduction principle is to actually reduce poverty, not just alleviate the effects of poverty. It's to address the interrelated root causes and not just individual symptoms. And so as you look down through these principles, and you worked with this group and did the evaluation and produced a marvelous report that's available on the Tamarack website about the inspired learning from these. So this is a great example of a very diverse set of communities where the coherence is provided by a set of principles, and you evaluated adherence to those principles. So let me ask you to say something about what that experience was like.
Well, and when you, as you were developing the book, you asked us to, myself and Jamie Gamble and others, to think about that, and I think we noted we for sure had these principles. We didn't think about principle-driven work. It was less implicit in their work than we would have liked to have made the general idea of working with principles. But now that I look back upon your questions, the evaluation questions, they're very, very useful. So to what extent did we find these principles relevant and meaningful for people? Well, by the end of the 10-year period, I think we had found 4 of them people had adhered to quite deliberately, and those were multi-sector, poverty reduction, community learning change, and comprehensive thinking and action. And the 5th one, building on community assets versus deficit, that was one that didn't provide enough guidance for us. We were still confused about that, and it was unevenly embraced and manifested. Number 2, in terms of adherence, I just spoke to that. 4 out of the 5 were quite important. And then number 3, we did run a summative-like assessment, in the sense that we wanted to draw some general conclusions about the merit or worth of this approach to doing things. And I think we found that we had some evidence to demonstrate the power of it, but the irony was that even though we felt these principles provided good guidance and could lead to results, the uptake by other people of the model seemed not to be driven even by our evaluation recommendations. The principles by themselves were enough to motivate people to replicate the approach. So I think we knew some of that, Michael, but looking back retrospectively at the vibrant community's experience through those principles has revealed different things to us, and I know we would have operated in an even stronger way had we embraced a principle-focused approach right up front, more deliberately.
The next example is about youth homelessness projects here in Minnesota. As you said, I'm based in Minneapolis and St. Paul in Minnesota. This report is available online. If you simply Google 9 evidence-based guiding principles to help youth overcome homelessness. This came out of working with 6 different organizations working with youth homelessness, providing different kinds of services, targeting different youth in different geographical parts of the greater Minneapolis-St. Paul area. But as they came together through a foundation grant to look at how they work, they found that although their services and work and target populations and were quite different, they were using a common set of principles. One example is the principle of being relationship-based. Build relationships by acting with youth in an honest, dependable, authentic, caring, and supportive way. Well, there are other youth homelessness programs that describe themselves as being entirely outcomes-oriented, and they view their job as getting kids off the street and into shelters and into housing. And in fact, some of them have staff manuals that say, we're not in the relationship business. We don't have time or competence or money to do relationship work with kids. Our job is simply to get them off the streets and into housing. And so it's very different to focus on the transaction, to focus on those kind of narrow outcomes versus being very relationship based. And the other principles of these programs, harm reduction, being trauma informed, building on youth assets, were very much evident. And we studied and interviewed youth who had experienced these programs, found out what their experiences were, and coded the presence of the principles as a way of evaluating them. That full report is available online. And again, in the workshops that we'll be doing across Canada in March, we'll be going into these examples in much greater depth.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And the book, how many case studies do you have? Well, I mean, you illustrate all your points in your books, Michael, but there's at least 5 exemplars or case studies in the book.
There are 6.
6, yes.
And they're some large scale. Well, this is one of them, the Youth Homelessness Program. But there's a Global Alliance for the Future of Food that's principles based, the international aid principles, and some agroecology principles that are guiding an entire field related to sustainability and climate change. So yes, there are some in-depth principles, and working with people around how those principles inform their action and then evaluating them is what we'll be doing in those workshops.
Exactly. Well, I feel you've given a real good taste of what this looks like, and of course enough for people to dig deeper into the book or participate in some workshops. Maybe let's touch on 3 relatively quick things before we get to this load of excellent questions we have just piling in now. Michael, I don't know if you've managed, you probably haven't, but they're really rolling in. Let's talk about, return to the idea of the niche for principle-based evaluation, but focus on when we, maybe elaborate when we shouldn't be doing principle-based evaluation or principle-focused evaluation.
Right. So the slide that shows the niche elements here really review what we've been talking about. They provide direction, but not detailed prescription. They're grounded in values. They're based on evidence. They have to be interpreted contextually. They require judgment. They inform choices at forks in the road. They're rudder for navigating complex dynamic systems. They point to impacts and outcomes, and they can be evaluated for both process and results. But they do require one to have a strong sense of working in complex dynamic systems. So if you are in simple space and you know exactly what you are trying to do and you've got a best practice model, then do that. It's not that there aren't principles to guide those kind of work in simple space, but a more concrete set of prescriptive practices is appropriate in those cases. And as you've said, it does require a sense of being able to deal with ambiguity and uncertainty, to be innovative. And as the next slide shows, it's being prepared for complexity. So this really emerges and is grounded in ways of dealing with complex dynamic systems, understanding complexity theory and systems change, and then using principles as a way of dealing with complexity and systems change.
Mm-hmm. And this, if you point out that principle-based evaluation and even outcome/impact evaluation, they're not mutually exclusive. It's just you're elevating principles as a unit of analysis, or not a unit of analysis, but as an evaluand, because we have several questions in here about, well, how do you weave together principle or outcome evaluation, or what do you do if some people are simply mostly interested in outcomes and not how to get there? This really is a tenet of utilization-focused evaluation, isn't it? What do the primary users want to know about?
And a good example, I mean, the 2 examples we looked at very quickly is, as you suggested, the vibrant communities principles were aimed at poverty reduction. So you looked at whether or not poverty was reduced in those communities, and in the youth homelessness programs, there the purpose of those initiatives is to get kids into stable situations off the streets where they are in danger and experiencing trauma. And an example of how the principle of building relationships relates to ultimately kids being able to stay out of the streets is that a major reason that kids end up homeless is because they can't do relationships. They don't get along with parents. They don't get along with roommates. They don't get along with authorities. They don't get along with teachers. They don't get along with police. And it turns out if you can't do relationships, you're probably going to be on the street. And so being relationship driven, these kids have a lot of bad history of relationships, not good models of relationships. And from the program's perspective, helping kids deal with relationships and treating them with respect and dealing with anger issues and dealing with all the things that get in the way of relationships, including dealing with landlords. If you can't get on with landlords, you're going to be on the streets. That relates then to the outcome of having housing. Relationships are directly related. That principle takes you into stable housing.
Well, in the same vein, Michael, as we before we go into this last question, I want to point out that a number of people have surfaced questions such as, let me read one or two, and this speaks to the tolerance levels or the interest of the primary users of information. Here we go. Let me read two sentences. Unfortunately, funders are interested in EPBs, transactions, and outcomes. How do you address that? Followed by, government funding focuses on deliverables and numbers. How do we report on relationship building as a quantifiable rather than transaction-based approach of the past? So we have some paradigm tensions here and some practice tensions. You must have heard this kind of these kinds of thoughts before on this.
In all of this, and it goes back to the developmental evaluation and social innovation and the work on getting to maybe how the world has changed. And it's a reason that you're asking these questions about what the niche is of principles-focused evaluation, because it's not for every situation. It's not for everything. And so I've been at this a long time. I'm not looking to overcome resistance. I find that the way to do this work is with early adopters. There are philanthropic foundations. There are funders who get this. The McConnell Foundation that's been a leader in supporting this kind of work. This is what they've based their work on. The examples in the book are foundations that are doing principles-focused work. The Global Alliance for the Future of Food, one of the examples, is a alliance of some 20 foundations, Canadian, North American, European, that have come together and are doing developmental principles-focused evaluation. There are places in governments that are trying to innovate, recognizing that they don't have answers, that they don't, that they're needing to operate in new ways as the world changes around things like climate change and equity issues. And so I'm looking for the early adopters. There are people who are coming and saying, we understand that business as usual, closed systems, project mentalities, results-based stuff, accountability-based stuff, that's still the dominant way in which people are operating, because that's what they've learned, that's what they know how to do. But people who are prepared to look at the world in different ways, who are really prepared to deal with complexity, and innovation, those early adopters, that's the niche for this kind of work.
Yeah. You've answered a lot of questions in the sidebar, Michael, just with that one idea that you're not, where the users are ready and eager, that's the place to use it. But the work of trying to convince someone or a system to do this, that's another kind of work entirely. And that's worth another book.
And in fact, I don't think it's something you can force people to do. You know, it's it's oxymoronic to say you have to have principles and follow them. We're going to force you to be principles focused. Well, that's self-defeating. If people need routine practices, if they need mandates, if they need best practices, if they need detailed prescriptions to get stuff done. That's the simple space, but that's not, you can't force people to be principles focused.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, this is terrific, Michael. And maybe why don't you just remark on this last slide, and then I'll throw a couple more questions your way because they're still coming in about when one should not use their approach. But you chose Downton Abbey here. That's a great metaphor.
Well, Lady Crawley, for Downton Abbey fans, always I found her to be very insightful, and she was said in one of the episodes, principles are like prayers, noble, of course, but awkward at a party. And you know, one of the things that has come from the book is that there are people who are uncomfortable with the idea of principles. Yeah, I have an exchange in the book with a very good colleague in adult education, Stephen Brookfield, who finds alleging that one is operating on the basis of principles to be arrogant. It's that it comes across as I'm better than you. You're in this simple goals-based project space, and I'm principles-based, and that makes me somehow a better human being. And that's certainly not the intent. It is very much a matter of matching the nature of the work to the nature of the situation, to do what's appropriate in simple space and complicated space and complexity space. And so it's not saying that one is better than the other. It's saying that they're different. And much of the nature of effectiveness is situational analysis, situational responsiveness, what's appropriate for different situations, and principles-focused evaluation for principles-driven people and principles-based initiatives is very much about complex dynamic systems.
Yep. Michael, this has been terrific. Thank you for this formal part of this presentation, and we know that it's already answered some of the questions that popped up on the side, but I'm going to pick a couple of more now because we have a couple minutes left that I feel are sort of universal, that many people will come across. So for those of you who gave very sort of surgical type questions, my apologies. We won't have time to go through all of them. So I am editing here a bit in terms of trying to find universal relevance. Here's a great question, Michael. What would the process look like in determining what or which principles will lead towards desired results? For example, if transparency is a principle, how do we know that is linked to achieving a desired result, leading to a desired result?
Well, that's a great question, and it's part of the conversation. So a major reason that organizations allege that they want to be transparent is that it increases the credibility of their organization to the people they serve and the people who fund them and the people to whom they're accountable, and that it is critical for democracies, for there to be an informed citizenry, for people to know what's going on. The Academy Award nominations have just come out, and one of the major films of the year that's getting a lot of attention, which I just saw, is The Post, which is the story of the Pentagon Papers and the Vietnam War. The entire travesty of the Vietnam War, going all the way back to the 1950s and President Eisenhower, was secrets, was a lack of transparency of the American government about what the military was doing in Southeast Asia for 30 years. Outright lying. And of course, we never see that going on today, but historically, it turns out there have been times when governments have been less than transparent, and that has consequences. And so we see it represented by a lack of faith in government, a lack of trust, or in other institutions. And so transparency as a principle has consequences, has the expectation about that it will engage people, that better decisions will get made, that there'll be more credibility. And so it's connecting those kind of dots. Why are we following a principle?
Yeah. Boy, all these things are tangled up, because another question relates to that. So you're saying there's a distinction between principles that are already somewhat self-evident or can be sort of framed and defended and advocated for up front. But do you also see sometimes that because this is complex work, principles emerge through learning and action, and that's part of the developmental process, because it seems to me that sometimes you can't agree on the front end to these principles. You have to do stuff together, and then they emerge.
The book has both kinds of examples, and that's very prescient. So there are times when some of the examples in the book are principles that came after 30 years of an organization working together, and to go to the next level, they asked me to work with them to inductively figure out what principles have they been following all this time, if any. But the Global Alliance for the Future of Food actually began by coming together around principles. In the youth homelessness study that we referred to, they went through a process of identifying some common principles, but then when we actually did the interviews with the youth and analyzed the data, a principle emerged that they had not identified together. It was so deeply embedded in how they thought that they hadn't made it articulated, and that was being journey oriented. That they always worked with these youth to not say that they were homeless youth, but that they were youth who happened to be homeless. And they always communicated to them that they were on a journey, that homelessness was not an identity, it was a phase. And the journey-oriented message, that principle turned out to be hugely important, and another distinguishing characteristic from other programs that stigmatized and labeled youth as homeless youth and carried with that the connotation that they weren't very worthy, that they ought to get their act together, and were fairly blaming. So yes, principles can be both explicit, articulated, but sometimes they're implicit and embedded, and the work of evaluation is to help make them explicit. That's part of what we do as evaluators, to look at what's going on and identify them, and they are emergent, and they may change over time.
Yeah, well, that hints to a related question around at what point, someone asked, is it advisable that an evaluator should come into the picture for principle-focused evaluation? And you just hit on that directly, Michael, but maybe you can point to this challenge that evaluators have between being concerned with articulating principles for downstream use on evaluation, but also being inevitably tangled up in developmental situations and other situations in helping conceptualize the intervention. So I think I know where you're going to go with this, but what a point does an evaluator come into this story of articulating and evaluating principles?
Well, it's a really important question, and the answer is that evaluation began as a back-end activity. And I was there at the beginning. We thought we were going to go out and evaluate whether or not programs were achieving their goals, and we found out they didn't have goals. In fact, they didn't even have programs. And so we end up moving from a back-end activity to a front-end activity by helping identify goals, doing SMART goals, helping do logic models so that people had a program. So evaluation has actually moved from being a back-end activity to a front-end activity. All the work of program design and logic modeling and clarifying goals work is front-end activity. So the principles work is very similar to that. When you're working with social innovators in complex dynamic situations and trying to help them understand what they're doing and develop a responsiveness to those situations, it's both a front end and a back end activity, and in the middle as well. It's a very dynamic, relationship-based co-creation, and the co-creation principle out of complexity is at the core of being principles focused. Yep,
and that includes that process. This refers to two questions around when one is articulating principles. One, evaluators can certainly, with the innovators, look to the existing evidence base, to look around at the evidence and saying, what principles can we derive from this?
That's right. The other new book I have out that we're not talking about today, but let me mention it for folks, is a book on facilitating evaluations. And some of these questions are about the role of the evaluator. I have a new book out called Facilitating Evaluation, Principles in Practice. And that book is based upon 5 facilitation principles for evaluators.
Yep. Yeah, and by the way, the book also has, referring to some other questions, lots of things around assessing fit and readiness and the guide framework, etc. So many of the questions that popped up are related to that. So that book is, by the way, Michael, that book, all your books are terrific, but that one has an extra emphasis on practical frameworks to help would-be adopters navigate principle-based evaluation. So I want to just confirm how terrific I thought it was in that regard as well. We have time for one or two last questions. Maybe this one I'll raise because it refers to a language that's emerging in the field of complexity-based management around strategy as simple rules. There's several books about this now. Harvard Business Review has written on it a bit, and I've seen it quite a bit in foundations and social innovation worlds. I think that this might be a matter of semantics, but are you familiar with this idea of strategy as simple rules? And do you, for all those who are working both with simple rules and principles, do you have any advice about how to distinguish between those two?
Yeah, I talk about it, in fact, and Mark, you've written a very nice section of this in the principles focused evaluation book and reflected on it in part. I think the language of rules is unfortunate in simple rules. They and that they're not really rules. Rules are things like stop at a stop sign, and they're absolute. So the simple rules, it typically is meant to describe patterns of behavior that are fundamental, that people engage in, and those patterns of behavior are ways of interacting with each other that become routinized and that everybody understands and knows. And so I distinguish the patterns of behavior that are implicit and that people are following may be done for any number of reasons. There are simple rules in prison, but they're not principles based. They're simply authoritarian based. And so whether or not behaviors are principles based is part of the inquiry, is part of the evaluation question, or if they're imposed, if they're mandated, if they're forced on people, they're still simple rules. Simple rules are usually meant to be based in complexity on self-organization, but in fact, they're not always based on that way. They are sometimes based on authoritarian situations. So part of the inquiry can be, what is the source of the behaviors in an organization? Are they principles-based? Are they authority-based? What are they based on? And that can be illuminating.
Yeah. Wow, Michael, we could keep going, and I regret that these things don't go longer, but an hour is more than enough to give people a taste of a great idea and practice like this, and more than enough to encourage people who want to go deeper, and I know a good portion of the audience is going to want to do that. I want to thank you for, again, writing the book. There's, in my mind, a distinction between developing a resource or a set of ideas that responds to an obvious demand and filling a gap, and the writing a resource and developing some ideas and practices to something that people are only beginning to understand is a real gap, and you've done that again. So thank you for all the work, and I'm sure people are going to love reading this book. And of course, we encourage people to pay attention to the workshop series that we're going to be running through Canadian cities in March. Thanks once again, Michael.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to Tamarack.
Okay, folks, over to Megan. Megan, just to give us a couple wrap-up thoughts, and then we're ready to start listening to it again on the podcast.
Yep, thanks so much. I'll just echo the thanks that have gone around already, and I just want to thank everybody who also joined us today. It's been touched on throughout the call today, but it is my pleasure to officially launch a workshop series that we have coming up here at Tamarack. That's going to be featuring Michael Quinn Patton and Mark Cabage. So this March, Michael and Mark will be offering a one-day evaluation masterclass that will explore the principles-focused evaluation approach and demonstrate its relevance and application in a range of settings. So this is a very special opportunity that we are thrilled to be able to offer. These master classes will be taking place in Toronto, Regina, Calgary, and Vancouver. and we'll have limited capacity. So if you want to take your learning in this area to the next level, I do encourage you to follow the link on your screen and register today. We are also hosting our annual Collective Impact 3.0 workshop, a 3-day offering that will explore the latest in the practice of collective impact from experts, practitioners, and early adopters of the work. This workshop is about a month away, so don't hesitate to sign up for that if collective impact is your thing. Lastly, in April, we are hosting a workshop in Kitchener, Ontario, all about asset-based community development with a focus on neighbourhood development and community health. This will be a rare opportunity to learn from Cormac Russell and John McKnight, 2 of the world's top trainers in asset-based community development. Needless to say, we have some incredible learning opportunities coming your way, and we encourage you to visit our website at www.tamarackcommunity.ca to get more information on each. And as promised, in a few days, we will email you with the recording of this webinar, along with other material related to today's call. We also welcome your feedback on these calls, so please do email Tamarack to let us know how we are doing. Thanks again, everybody, so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.